My daughter called me on the 18th of December. I was in the kitchen, making soup, the way I make soup every Sunday evening in winter, slowly, with more attention than it probably requires, because when you live alone, attention is something you have to spend somewhere, or it accumulates into something heavier. The phone rang. I saw her name. I turned down the stove. I answered. She said, "Dad." I said, "Emily." She said, "I need to talk to you about Christmas." I said, "All right." She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone who has prepared what they are about to say and is giving themselves one final opportunity to not say it. Then she said, "I don't think you should come this year." I held the phone. She said, "It's just, Mark's family is going to be there. His parents, his brother, the whole thing. And they don't really, they think my stepfather raised me. And I just don't want there to be questions. I don't want them asking about, it gets complicated. I hope you understand." I looked out the kitchen window. The street was already decorated. Someone on my block puts their lights up the first week of December every year without fail. Red and white. They make the wet pavement glow. I said, "I do." She said, "Thank you, Dad. I knew you would." We talked for 3 more minutes about nothing specific. Her job, a film she had seen, something about the weather where she lived. Then she said she had to go. She said she would call on Christmas Day. I said, "Take care of yourself, Emily." She said, "You too, Dad." She hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I turned the stove back up. I stirred the soup. I told her I understood. I lied. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a house that is the right size for the person I have become. I spent 31 years as a firefighter. I retired at 62 with a bad knee and a good pension and a collection of memories that I keep organized in the specific way you keep things you cannot display and cannot discard. And on Christmas Eve, 7 days after my daughter asked me not to come, I put on my old jacket and I drove to the volunteer station and I signed in for a shift, because I had nowhere else to be, and because that is what I have always done with the hours that needed filling. That morning changed everything, not because I planned it to, because a shopping mall caught fire, and because I was the closest person who knew what to do. Let me tell you about my daughter properly, because she deserves to be understood before she is judged, and because the full picture of Emily is more complicated than one phone call on a December evening. Emily Ann Brooks, 38 years old. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, though she would describe her stubbornness as determination and my stubbornness as obstinacy, and she is not entirely wrong about either description. She was born when I was 30. Her mother Patricia and I had been married 4 years by then, and the marriage was already showing the specific strain of 2 people who had gotten together for reasons that seemed sufficient at 25 and revealed themselves as insufficient by 28. We were not bad to each other. We were simply wrong for each other in the quiet, grinding way that produces not dramatic endings, but slow ones. Patricia and I separated when Emily was 6, divorced when she was 8. The years that followed were the years they always are, when a father is on shift work and a custody arrangement and a pension that does not yet exist. I had Emily every other weekend and 2 weeks in the summer, and I tried to make those times count in the way you try to make things count when you know their edges. We went to parks and museums and hardware stores because Emily, from the age of about 4, had a genuine interest in how things were built that I recognized as coming entirely from me and that I found deeply satisfying. We were close in those years, as close as alternate weekends allow. Then Patricia met Richard. Richard is a businessman, the kind who fills a room without doing anything specific. He is not an unkind man. I want to say that because I believe it, and because saying it is harder than not saying it. He is not unkind. He is simply large in the way that people with considerable money and considerable confidence tend to be large. And he filled the space in Emily's life that I had been present in only on schedule. She began calling him Dad when she was 14. I found out from Patricia, not from Emily. I said nothing about it, not because I wasn't affected, but because I had learned, by 14, that the things I said about Richard would land on Emily rather than on Richard, and Emily was the one I was trying not to hurt. She went to university, which Richard paid for. She built a career in marketing, which she is good at in the specific way she is good at most things she decides to be good at. She married a man named Connor at 28, which did not last, and she married a man named Mark at 35, which has. Mark is also a businessman, somewhat smaller than Richard, financially, but in the same general category of person. His family is the kind that has opinions about things, which is not a crime, but which creates a particular atmosphere at gatherings where the opinions are presumed to be shared. I had met Mark twice, both times briefly, at events where my presence was accommodated rather than welcomed. He was polite. He had the politeness of someone for whom politeness is a social tool rather than a natural state, which is a different thing from warmth, but is not nothing. I understood, from those two meetings, what Emily was. She was two people. She was the daughter who called me on Sunday evenings, imperfectly but consistently, who asked how my knee was and remembered the names of my neighbors, and who said, at the end of every call, "Love you, Dad," in a way that I believed entirely. And she was the wife of Mark, the stepdaughter of Richard, the woman in a life that had grown up around an absence and filled that absence with other things, good things, real things, and that could not easily accommodate the return of what had been absent without rearranging everything. I understood all of that. Understanding it did not make the phone call easier, but I understood it. I told her I did. I turned the stove back up. I made my soup, and I went to bed on the 18th of December, and I did not think about Christmas for 6 days. On the 7th day, I put on my jacket and I drove to the volunteer station. Let me tell you about the 31 years, because the 31 years are why Christmas Eve happened the way it did. Not the specific skills, though those matter, but the shape of the person those years produced, and why that person, on a cold morning with nowhere to be, drove to a volunteer station and signed in for a shift, rather than sitting alone in a decorated house, watching other people's celebrations on television. I joined the fire service at 22, not because of a dramatic calling or a formative event or any of the narrative reasons that people sometimes construct around their career choices in retrospect. I joined because a man named Gerald, who lived on my street, was a firefighter, and he seemed to find his work genuinely meaningful, and meaningful work was what I was looking for at 22, and had not yet found anywhere else. The training was harder than I expected. I was fit. I had always been reasonably fit, but fitness is not the same as the specific physical and mental preparation required for the work, and the months of training taught me things about my own limits that I had not previously had occasion to discover. I discovered I did not have many, not in the arrogant sense, in the practical sense. I found that I could endure considerable discomfort without it affecting my functioning. I found that I was calm in conditions designed to produce panic. I found that the specific combination of decision-making under pressure and physical execution that the work required was one that I was, without having known it before the training, well suited to. I was good at it. I was good at it for 31 years. I will not give you a list of the fires, not because they are not real or not worth describing, but because a list of fires is not what this story is about. What this story is about is something that happened 20 years before Christmas Eve, in the middle of those 31 years, that I have never told my daughter. I have never told anyone. It happened in April, A warehouse fire in the industrial district, the kind that starts small and achieves its full ambition before anyone has fully registered what it intends to be. By the time we arrived, it was already a serious situation. By the time we were inside, it was a situation that had stopped being manageable in the standard sense and become something else. There were workers inside, 4 of them, confirmed. 2 got out before we arrived, 2 did not. The 2 who did not get out were in the upper section of the building, behind a collapse that had happened fast and without the warning that collapses sometimes give. My partner that night was a man named Kevin, who I had worked alongside for 9 years and who was one of the finest firefighters I have ever known. Kevin and I found them. Getting them out required going through a section of the building that was not going to remain navigable for very long. This was not a guess. It was a professional assessment based on 30 years of reading structures in the specific way that 30 years teaches you to read them. We went through. We got the 2 workers out. The section collapsed behind us. Kevin broke his arm in the collapse. I broke 2 ribs and sustained burns on my left hand that took 3 months to fully heal, and that left marks I still carry. Both workers survived. I was given a National Medal of Valor. It is the highest recognition awarded to civilian first responders in this country. I have it in a box, in the drawer of the nightstand beside my bed. I have shown it to no one. When the department wanted to hold a ceremony, I asked them to keep it quiet. My chief at the time, a man named Harold Voss, who had known me for 15 years and who understood the request without requiring explanation, arranged for the presentation to happen in his office with 4 people present: Harold, Kevin, myself, and a representative from the state office who was required by protocol. No press, no announcement, no public record that I could not prevent, but that I made no effort to promote. Patricia knew something had happened at work. I told her I had been in a fire that went badly and that I was recovering and that it was over and it was fine. She accepted this with the mixture of relief and frustration that military and emergency service spouses often feel when they receive partial information and know it is partial. Emily was 18. She was about to leave for university. I did not tell her because she was about to leave for university and because the version of events that required telling was longer than the version that didn't. I kept meaning to tell her later. Later never arrived with the right shape. And then so many years passed that the telling would have required explaining why I hadn't told her already, which made the telling feel more complicated than the not telling, which is the specific trap that silences most of us most of the time. So the medal stayed in the drawer, and I stayed quiet, and I drove to the volunteer station on Christmas Eve morning and signed in for a shift. The Riverside Mall was 12 minutes from the volunteer station. I know this because I drove past it twice a week on my way to the grocery store and had timed it once out of the mild interest of someone who times things occasionally without needing a reason. I was not thinking about the Riverside Mall at 9:45 on Christmas Eve morning. I was thinking about the inventory list for the volunteer station's equipment locker, which needed updating, and about whether the coffee in the station's machine was as bad as it had been the previous week, or whether someone had done something about it. The radio call came in at 9:52. Structure fire. Riverside Mall. Multiple persons reported inside. Units responding. I was the senior person in the station at that moment. The 2 volunteers with me that morning were both good. A young man named Tyler, who had been volunteering for 8 months, and a woman named Sandra, who had been there 3 years. But I was the one with 31 years, and the shift coordinator looked at me when the call came in the way people look at the person they need to make a decision. I said, "Let's go." We were there in 9 minutes. The fire was in the east wing of the mall, which housed a food court and a cinema and a cluster of retail stores that had been busy since opening because it was Christmas Eve, and the specific combination of last-minute urgency and seasonal goodwill that Christmas Eve produces in shopping environments had brought out a significant number of people. The primary units were already on scene when we arrived. The incident commander, a woman I knew from my service years, named Captain Rita Okafor, gave me a fast briefing. East Wing fully involved. Sprinkler system had activated, but was insufficient. Smoke spread to the central atrium. Evacuation in progress. 3 persons confirmed unaccounted for from the cinema area on the upper level. A family, 2 parents and a child. The parents had reported their child separately from them when the alarm sounded and had not found each other in the evacuation. I said, "What's the access situation?" Rita said, "East stairwell is compromised. Central escalators are smoke-filled but structurally okay. West stairwell is clear but on the opposite end." I said, "Cinema is east side upper level." She said, "Yes." I looked at the building. 31 years of reading structures. I said, "The central atrium. The smoke is filling from the bottom up or the top down?" She checked with her radio. Bottom up. The fire was feeding upward through the east wing, but the smoke was banking down from the ceiling of the atrium and filling the upper level fastest. I said, "The cinema area might be cleaner than the atrium right now." "Temporarily," she said. "Temporarily is right." I said, "Then temporarily is what we have." I went in through the west stairwell. The central atrium of the Riverside Mall was the kind of space that architects designed to feel generous. High ceiling, glass roof, the spatial quality of somewhere that wants you to feel that there is plenty of room for everything. In normal conditions, it was pleasant. In the current conditions, it was a column of gray-brown smoke that was thickening visibly as I watched. I moved along the upper level toward the east side. The smoke was manageable with my equipment. The visibility was poor, but not zero. I could hear the fire in the east wing, not the dramatic roar that fires have in films, but the specific sound of a serious structural fire, which is deeper and more percussive than most people expect, and which, after 31 years, I have learned to read the way you learn to read any language you have lived inside of long enough. The cinema was dark when I reached it. The emergency lighting was on, but the power had been interrupted, and the combination of smoke and insufficient lighting made the space difficult to read. I called out. A child's voice answered. He was 7 years old. His name, as he told me with the specific clarity that frightened children sometimes achieve, was Oliver. He had been in the cinema bathroom when the alarm sounded. He had come out to find the cinema empty. He had followed the emergency exit signs, but the emergency exit on the east side was not accessible due to the fire, and the sign for the west exit was obscured by smoke, and he had not been able to read it. He was sitting in the second row of the cinema, with his knees pulled up and his arms around them. I said, "Oliver, my name is Daniel. I'm here to take you to your parents." He said, "Are you a real fireman?" I said, "I used to be. I'm close enough." He said, "Okay." I got him onto my back. I moved back through the cinema, along the upper level, past the thickening smoke of the atrium that was another 5 minutes from being unnavigable, down the west stairwell, and out through the west entrance, where Tyler was stationed with the evacuation perimeter. His parents were at the perimeter. I will not describe that reunion in detail because some things do not need description. The boy's name was Oliver, and his parents held him with the specific completeness of people who have spent 11 minutes not knowing and have now been given the answer. I went back in. The second call was from a unit working the ground level of the East Wing, an elderly couple, confirmed sighted in the East Wing food court before the evacuation, but not confirmed out. The man used a mobility aid, a walker, which made the evacuation speed of the general crowd impossible for them to match. The East Wing by this point was not accessible from the standard approaches. Captain Okafor told me this when I came out with Oliver. I asked about the service corridor that runs behind the retail units on the ground level of the East Wing. In older malls, the service corridors are built to different specifications than the retail space. often with better fire containment properties, because they are utility spaces, and utility spaces in commercial construction of a certain era are built with a different set of priorities than the customer-facing areas. The Riverside Mall was built in 1987. I knew this because I had read the fire assessment documents for this mall as part of a regional review I had volunteered for 8 years ago. Because I was retired and had time, and because reading fire assessment documents for regional commercial properties was, for me, a form of leisure activity that I recognized was unusual but did not feel the need to apologize for. The service corridor ran the full length of the east wing. It had its own access point on the south exterior wall. I told Rita. She sent 2 of her people with me. The service corridor was passable, smoke present, but below the critical threshold. The fire was above us in the east wing upper level, and the corridor's construction was doing what 1987 utility construction does when it is doing its job. We found them in the food court. The man's name was George. His wife's name was Eleanor. He was 74 and she was 71, and they had been in the mall because they came to the Riverside Mall food court every Christmas Eve for 40 years, for the specific reason that the food court had a bakery that made a particular type of Danish pastry that Eleanor had decided, 40 years ago, was the best she had ever tasted, and they had not missed a Christmas Eve visit in 4 decades. George told me all of this while we moved him through the service corridor with his walker. He said it with the complete calm of a man who has decided that this is simply one of the things that happens in a long life, and that the appropriate response is to continue being himself. Eleanor said, "George, let the man work." George said, "He seems like he can work and listen at the same time." I said, "I can." We got them out through the south exterior. Eleanor looked at the building for a moment. She said, "I hope the bakery is all right." George said, "Eleanor," she said, "I'm being practical. That's 40 years of Christmas Eves." I said, "They can rebuild a bakery." She looked at me. She said, "Yes, I suppose they can." I gave them to the paramedics. I went back to the perimeter. The third situation was a pregnant woman who had been in one of the retail units on the ground level and had been separated from her companion during the evacuation. She had found her way to a stairwell that was clear and had come down safely, but was now in significant distress, not from smoke inhalation, from the physical stress of moving quickly in the 34th week of pregnancy while frightened. She was sitting on the curb outside the south entrance when I came out with George and Eleanor. A paramedic was already with her. I sat on the curb beside her for 11 minutes while the paramedic assessed her and while she breathed in the specific controlled way of someone who has been told to breathe slowly and is trying her best. Her name was Sarah. She said,
"I'm all right."
"I'm all right. Is everyone out?" I said. "We're working on it." She said, "There was a little boy in the cinema. I saw him when the alarm went off." I said, "His name is Oliver. He's with his parents." She said, "Oh, thank God." Then she looked at me. She said, "Are you all right?" I looked down. My jacket had a burn mark on the left sleeve from a piece of debris in the east wing corridor. I had not noticed it. I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You don't look fine." I said, "I look fine for what just happened." She said, "Fair point." By 10:47, the building was fully evacuated and confirmed clear. 49 minutes. I sat on the curb next to Sarah until her companion arrived, running, from the parking lot where she had been waiting with their car when the alarm sounded. Then I stood up. I found a space at the perimeter where I was out of the way of the ongoing work. I stood there. I was 68 years old, standing on a cold curb in a parking lot that smelled of smoke, with a burn mark on my sleeve and a bad knee that was going to complain about this for the next 3 days. And I felt something that I have felt before, after situations like this, and that I have never found the precise word for. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. Something like, "That is what I am for." The television crew arrived at 10:31. I saw them from the perimeter, a camera operator and a reporter in a red coat, moving quickly, establishing position, doing the specific work of people who have been sent to cover something that is still developing and need to be ready when it arrives at its most significant moment. I paid them the amount of attention I pay most things in professional situations, enough to register their presence, not enough to be distracted by it. They spoke to Captain Okafor first. She gave a brief operational statement. They spoke to a paramedic. They spoke to two people from the evacuation who were willing to describe their experience. I was at the perimeter with Tyler and Sandra. Sandra said, "They're coming over here." I said, The reporter was a young woman, mid-20s, with the specific energy of someone who is good at their job and knows it, but has not yet learned to make the knowing invisible. She spoke to Tyler first. He told her about the response. Briefly, accurately. She thanked him. She turned to Sandra. Sandra described the approach to the scene. Concise, factual. Then the reporter turned to me. She said, "Sir, can you tell me what happened when you arrived on scene?" I said, "We responded to the call. I went in twice." "We got everyone out," she said. "You went in twice?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can you tell me? There are reports of a child being recovered from the cinema area. Was that you?" I said, "A boy named Oliver. He was in the cinema bathroom when the alarm went off and got separated from the evacuation. He's with his parents." She said, "And the couple that was reported in the East Wing?" I said, "Out through the service corridor. They're with paramedics." She said, "Sir." She looked at me for a moment. The specific look of someone who is assembling a picture and has just realized the picture is larger than they initially understood. She said, "You personally extracted a child from the upper level, an elderly couple from the East Wing through a service corridor, and you assisted a pregnant woman outside the south entrance. All of this in under 50 minutes. I said, "There were other people working." This was a coordinated response. She said, "But you specifically?" I said, "I was the senior person available with relevant experience. I did what the situation required." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Sir, what is your name?" I looked at the building. The fire in the East Wing was contained now, the smoke changing character as the suppression took effect. I thought about a kitchen. I thought about soup that I turned down to answer the phone. I thought about a voice saying, "Please don't come this year." I looked at the reporter. I said, "Daniel Brooks." She said, "And are you a firefighter?" I said, "I was. For 31 years. I'm retired." She said, "And you were here today because—" I said, "I volunteer on Christmas Eve. I have for 6 years." She said, "Why Christmas Eve specifically?" I looked at the parking lot, at the families reunited at the perimeter, at Oliver, who was standing between his parents with his arms around both of them and his face pressed into his father's coat, at George and Eleanor, who were sitting side by side in the back of a paramedic vehicle and who appeared to be holding hands. I said, "It seemed like a useful day to be somewhere." She held the microphone. She looked at me. She was going to ask another question. I said, "That's all I have. Merry Christmas." I walked back to the station vehicle. I did not watch the news that evening. I went back to the station. I wrote my incident report with the thoroughness I have always brought to incident reports, because a thorough incident report is a form of respect for what happened and for the people it happened to. I checked the equipment. I drank 1 cup of coffee that was slightly better than the previous week, which I noted. I drove home at 3 in the afternoon. I changed my jacket. I cleaned the burn on my left forearm, which I had noticed during the drive home, and which was minor, the kind that requires cleaning and covering, and nothing more serious. I made dinner. I ate alone at my kitchen table with the radio on, because I like the radio in the evening, specifically the program that plays older music on Christmas Eve, because it has played the same playlist since I started listening 20 years ago, and consistency in small things is something I find genuinely comforting. At 7:15 my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered, a voice I did recognize, Thomas Vance, my former chief's deputy, who I had not spoken to in 2 years. He said, "Danny." I said, "Tom." He said, "I'm watching the news." I said, "All right." He said, "Channel 7, Christmas Eve coverage of the Riverside Mall fire." I said, "I was there." He said, "I know you were there. I'm watching you being there. They've run the segment 3 times in the last hour." I said, "That seems like a lot." He said, "Danny, they ran your name." I said, "I know." She asked. He said, "And they pulled your record." They always pull the record when someone's name comes up in something like this. Your name in a situation like this pulls a specific record. I said, "Tom." He said, "The medal." I said, "Tom." He said, "It's on the screen, Danny. They've got the official citation. Your photo from the presentation. The whole thing." I sat down at the kitchen table. The radio was still playing. I said, "How bad?" He said, "It's not bad. It's, Danny, they're calling it the story of Christmas Eve, the retired firefighter with the National Medal of Valor, who spends Christmas Eve volunteering because it's a useful day to be somewhere." That's the segment. That's what they're running. I said nothing. Tom said, "Your phone is going to start ringing." I wanted to be the first call. I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm having dinner." He said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I'm all right, Tom." He said, "Merry Christmas, Danny." I said, "Merry Christmas." He hung up. I sat at the table. The radio played. At 7:43, my phone rang again. I looked at the screen. Emily. I looked at it for a long moment. I answered. She said, "Dad." Her voice was different from the voice on December 18th. The same voice, technically, the same person, but with something in it that was not there before, something stripped away, something that had been between us for a long time and was no longer there now. She said, "Dad, I'm watching the news." I said, "All right." She said, "Channel 7. I said, "Tom called me." "I know." She said, "You." She stopped. "The medal." "Dad, the National Medal of Valor." I said, "Yes." She said, "20 years ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "You never told me." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "Because by the time it seemed important to tell you, so much time had passed that telling you meant explaining why I hadn't told you already, and I didn't have a good enough explanation for that part." She was quiet. She said, "Dad, today, the boy, the couple." I said, "Oliver, and George and Eleanor." She said, "You went in twice." I said, "The situation required it." She said, "You're 68 years old." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "Dad." I said, "Emily." She said, "I told you not to come for Christmas." I said, "I know." She said, "Because I was—" She stopped. "Because I was embarrassed. Not of you, of the situation, of having to explain, of what Mark's family would think about." She stopped again. She said, "That's not a good enough reason." I said, "No." She said, "It's not even close to a good enough reason." I said, "No." She was crying, not dramatically, the quiet crying of someone who is trying to hold it together and is not quite managing. She said, "I'm so sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "That's not enough." I said, "It's a start." She said, "I want you to come for Christmas." I said, "Emily." She said, "Please, I want you here. I should have always wanted you here." I said, "It's Christmas Eve." She said, "I know. Please." I looked at the kitchen. at the pot on the stove, at the table set for one, at the window where the neighbor's lights made the wet pavement glow red and white. I said, "It's 4 hours." She said, "I know. I'll wait up. Mark will wait up. Please, Dad." I said, "Let me finish my dinner." She said, "Okay." I said, "And I'll need to find flowers. Everything will be closed." She said, "Dad, you don't need to bring—" I said, "I always bring flowers when I visit someone's home for the first time. That's not changing." She was quiet. Then she said, "There's a petrol station 20 minutes from here that's open all night. They have flowers." I said, "Petrol station flowers?" She said, "They're not that bad." I said, "I'll find them." She said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." I said, "I know you do." I said, "I love you too." I finished my dinner. I left the house at 8:45. I found the petrol station. The flowers were not that bad. Carnations and something yellow that I could not specifically identify, but that looked cheerful in the way of things that are trying to compensate for their surroundings. I bought them. I drove. 4 hours in winter on quiet roads is a particular kind of time. The highways mostly empty. The towns I passed through dressed in their Christmas lights and largely still. The radio playing the same Christmas Eve playlist it always plays. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about 31 years and what they had added up to. Not the medal. The medal is a piece of metal in a box in a drawer, and it is a real thing, but it is not the thing. The thing is the 31 years of showing up. The ordinary shifts, the small fires and the large ones, the situations where the training was enough, and the situations where the training ran out, and something else had to take over. Kevin, with his arm broken in a corridor in April, who I still call on his birthday. I thought about Emily at 6 years old, the last full year of the marriage, when she used to wait at the window on Friday evenings for my car to pull into the drive. How she would be off the couch and at the door before I had turned off the engine. How she would hold my hand when we walked and tell me everything that had happened in the week I had missed in the specific, breathless, run-on way of someone for whom chronological order is less important than completeness. I thought about the drawer beside my bed, about 20 years of not telling, about the ways that silence accumulates, the way all things accumulate, not dramatically but weight by weight, until you discover one day that the thing you were not saying has become the shape of the space between you and the person you were not saying it to. I did not think about Mark's family, or what they thought, or what any of this would look like from the outside. I thought about an apartment on Christmas Eve and a petrol station with flowers that were not that bad. I thought about Oliver pressing his face into his father's coat. I thought about George and Eleanor holding hands in the back of a paramedic vehicle. I drove. At 12:41 in the morning, I pulled into a street in a town 4 hours from my house, and I found the address Emily had given me, a house with lights on downstairs. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I picked up the petrol station flowers. I walked to the door. Before I could knock, the door opened. Emily. She was in the doorway in a jumper and socks, and she looked at me the way she used to look at me from the window on Friday evenings, 40-something years ago, except that she was 38 now, and she had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she was crying properly now, without trying to hold it together. She said, "Dad!" I said, "I brought flowers." She said, "I see that." I said, "They're from a petrol station." She said, "I know. I told you where to go." She stepped forward. She put her arms around me, the way she used to, when she was 6 years old, completely, without reserve, with the full weight of everything she was feeling. I held on. We stood in the doorway for a while. Behind her, through the hallway, I could see the Christmas tree in the living room. Mark was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in the 2 previous meetings. Something open. Something that was trying to find the right shape. He said, "Mr. Brooks, can I get you something? Tea, or—" I said, "Tea would be good." He said, "Right." He went back into the kitchen. Emily pulled back and looked at me. She said, "He watched the whole segment, twice." I said, "All right." She said, "He didn't say anything for about 10 minutes after." I said, "That's understandable." She said. Then he said, "Emily, call your father." I looked at her. She said, "He said, please." I said, "That's a good man." She said, "Yes, he is. You'd know that if I'd let you know him." I said, "There's time." She said, "Yes." She took my coat. I went inside. It is February now. I am at the kitchen table in my house, which is the right size for the person I have become, with coffee, which I have been drinking too much of since the Riverside Mall because my knee has been limiting my walks, and the coffee fills the time that the walks used to fill. The television coverage was more than Tom described on that phone call. The segment ran nationally. I received calls for 3 days from numbers I did not recognize, all of which I let go to voicemail, and most of which I did not return. The station received a commendation. Tyler and Sandra were included, which was right. They were there. They did their part. Captain Okafor sent me a note. 2 lines. "You haven't changed, Danny. Merry Christmas. I have it on the refrigerator." Kevin called. He said, "I always told you, you can't retire from being who you are." I told him to stop being philosophical. He said, "I'll stop when you start." We talked for an hour. The medal is still in the drawer. I have not moved it. I considered moving it, briefly, after everything. But it is where it has always been, and moving it seemed like a gesture toward something that does not need a gesture. The medal is not the story. The medal is a consequence of the story. The story is 31 years, and those are complete, and they do not need to be displayed to be real. Emily came to my house on the second weekend of January. She drove 4 hours. She came alone, which I had not expected. She said she wanted it to be just the 2 of us the first time. We cooked together, not anything complicated. Pasta, which is what we always made together when she was small, because it is forgiving, and because it has enough steps to keep 2 people occupied and talking without requiring either of them to pay attention to the cooking instead of each other. We talked for a long time, about the years, about what they had contained, and what they had cost, and what had been worth the cost, and what hadn't. We talked about Richard, which we had never fully talked about. We talked about Patricia, who is well, and lives in another state, and has remarried someone who, by Emily's account, is quiet and kind and makes her mother laugh. We talked about the drawer beside my bed. I showed her the medal. She held it for a long time without saying anything. Then she set it down on the kitchen table between us. She said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I said, "Because it didn't change anything about what I was trying to be for you. A father. That's all. The medal didn't make me better at that. The work didn't make me better at that. The only thing that made me better at it was being present, and I wasn't always present enough, and no amount of decoration changes that." She said, "You were more present than you know." I said, "I was present on schedule." She said, "You were present in the ways that mattered." I said, "Some of them." She said, "Dad, stop apologizing for the parts that didn't work. Start accepting the parts that did." I looked at my daughter, 38 years old, her mother's eyes, my stubbornness, and something of her own that belongs entirely to her, that I did not give her, and neither did anyone else, that she built herself from everything that happened to her, and around her, and in spite of her. I said, "You turned out well." She said, "I had help." I said, "From a lot of people." She said, "Yes, but also from you." We had pasta. She stayed the weekend. She is coming back in March. Mark is coming with her. I have already looked up whether there is a good restaurant nearby that is not a petrol station. There is. I told my daughter on December 18th that I understood. I lied. I want to be honest about that. I have been honest about most things in this account, and I want to be honest about that too. I did not understand. I understood the mechanics of the situation, the new husband's family, the stepfather's image, the inconvenience of a quiet old man who doesn't fit neatly into the picture. I understood all of that, but I did not understand how a daughter could look at her father and find him something to manage rather than someone to love. I understood it better after Christmas Eve, not because of the fire, but because of what happened after it. Because Emily called at 7:43 and her voice was different. Because something had been removed between us that had been there for years and that I had not known how to remove myself. I had been waiting to be needed. I had been wrong to wait. The lesson of 68 years, if I have one, is this. The people who love you are not always the people who say so. And the people who have difficulty saying so are not always people who do not feel it. Sometimes they are people who have built a life in an absence and do not know how to make room for the presence without dismantling what they built. You have to make room for them to make room. I should have driven the 4 hours uninvited. I should have shown up at the door with petrol station flowers 10 years ago. I should have made it easy for her to see that I was still there, even when she was looking somewhere else. I did not, but I will, I told her. That night in December, standing in her doorway with carnations and something yellow, that I would be there next Christmas if she wanted her dad. She said, "I want my dad." I said, "Then I'll be here." That is the whole of it. If you have someone who is looking somewhere else right now, if you have been waiting for them to look back, if you have been sitting in a quiet house on Christmas Eve, making soup and answering the phone and saying you understand when you don't, stop waiting. Drive the 4 hours. Bring the flowers, even if they are from a petrol station. Show up. That is what you are for. I'll see you in the next one.